I did not stop the car at any time. I passed no other vehicle. I saw no other person. Kennedy was driving approximately 20 miles an hour, taking no particular notice that Dyke Road was unpaved or that he was not heading for the ferry landing. He had applied brakes a fraction of a second before I was on the bridge and about to go off. The next thing I recall is the movement of Mary Jo next to me, the struggling, perhaps hitting or kicking me, and I, at this time, opened my eyes and realized I was upside down, that water was crashing in on me, that it was pitch black, and I was able to get a half a gulp, I would say, of air before I became completely immersed in the water. I realized that Mary Jo and I had to get out of that car. Good morning, you guys. Welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I hope to earn your subscription today. Well, it has been a busy time. I don't know about for you, but for me, it's been a crazy week. If you've been a part of this book, then you have heard me talk about my husband's 91-year-old uncle who has been like a fixture in our family. And part of why I've mentioned him in maybe a couple of recent episodes is that he's been on my mind because he did pass the week before Christmas, and we had his funeral 2 days before Christmas. So my oldest son came in, my other son came down, and so I had all of our children under one roof for Christmas, which was unexpected. We mourned together, we celebrated together, and it was a really meaningful time. So we did not get snow, and I thought that'd be something fun that I would really like to hear from you guys about. We actually had like drizzly cold rain, but I'd love to know, what was it like for your Christmas? What was the weather like? And did you have anything unusual or just an unexpected treat happen for you during the week, or even anything sad? Because we had all of the above. So I'd love to hear about your Christmas, and I've made a decision that I want to share with you. So part of it relates to something I have here on my desk. I have this giant half-gallon water, and the reason it's there is because I'm doing 75 hard right now. I'm on, this is day 12. And so between that and getting back into next semester, and just, I've heard from you all that it's been hard as we've gone through this book to have kind of a stunted, where we're doing other books, but then once a week we revisit this one, that's just too complex. And so what I have decided for the present, probably at least for a couple months, is that we are just going to focus exclusively on the Palace Papers, and I will do some occasional vintage magazine reads. So that will still be an occasional punctuation in the middle of our book. But I'm not going to try to juggle 2 or more books right now. As we get closer, maybe past spring break, towards the end of the semester, we'll see what we want to do. I could foresee, if I'm not teaching, I could foresee doing 2 books, each one having 2 episodes a week. So that's all for that. I just kind of wanted to do that little housekeeping and let you know where my brain is right now, that I've got multiple things that I'm juggling, and I just think it'll be better for all of us, better for your experience as a viewer here on this channel, but also better for me as I try to manage the books that we're going to go ahead and get through this book, finish it up. So we will be doing that hopefully in the next week or 2, and then go all full force with Palace Papers, which has been fascinating. If you are not following this book, I just want to give a little plug to this one. So the whole premise of this book is between the deaths of Princess Diana and then right up until the book was published 5 months before the death of Queen Elizabeth. And so right now we are in the section of the book where we are talking through those 25 years that she's experiencing. And so this has been fascinating, and I want to invite you to join us for it because I'm really enjoying it. I didn't realize how many different stories there were, some that we've heard and that are good refreshers, some that I had never heard. So Please come and join us for that. And then now we are going to get into Chappaquiddick. And y'all, today is such a big episode. I'm really excited. Until we get done with the book, basically every episode is going to be meaty and interesting and give us the information we need to kind of round out our full understanding of Chappaquiddick. We've been kind of having all this legal dickering about whether or not certain things were going to happen. Now we are going to focus for, I think, 3 chapters on all the things that get us up to the doorstep of the inquest, and then we will get to hear from Ted, I believe. I think we're going to get there today. So let's get going. Chapter 47. On October 30th, 1969, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court granted Senator Kennedy's request that the press and public be barred from the inquest. The court ruled that while the procedure was not accusatory, if it were held in public, the activities of the news media might make it difficult, if not impossible, to ensure a defendant a fair trial if there was any criminal proceedings that follow. So you remember, this is what his lawyers have been pushing for all along, and ultimately it's what's right. We want no human in American courts to go into their situation disadvantaged. We want everybody to have as good of a defense as they can. We want everybody to have as fair of a shake as they can, so that no one is prejudiced before you even go to have your peers judge whether or not you're guilty of a crime. So if there ever was going to be a criminal proceedings, they're guarding against it now by saying this is not going to be publicized, which is great. I would say constitutional rights secured. The Kopechne inquest presented unusual problems because it had great public interest, and the difficulty had not been lessened by Senator Kennedy's own attempts on television. These things, by making public statements and even going to places like public places with the view that he was going to go by the press wall and that kind of thing, by doing that, he had actually increased public interest, speculation, and given people the sense that they should expect a full review and examination of these things, because he was the one, if you remember with his television broadcast, bringing his issues to the public themselves. But nonetheless, the court's ruling now would apply to all future inquests. So now everybody, Ted Kennedy or not, is protected. The Wall Street Journal, when they learned about this, they said that rather than gathering a crescendo of publicity, the press had only exposed a crescendo of bungling in the legal process. And they accused that this was all because authorities were too willing to absolve the senator of anything beyond leaving the scene of an accident. So they're leveling the charge that all of the authorities are just wanting to basically say, well, he left the scene of an accident and that shouldn't have happened, but there was no other problem beyond that. Sooner or later, the full and complete story about what happened that night on Chappaquiddick will come out despite all attempts to keep it smothered, the New Bedford Standard Times said. And I don't know if you remember, but a couple episodes ago, I went looking for an article from the New Bedford Standard Times, and I believe it's no longer in print. So, maybe because of predictions like this, they were wrong. I would love to for the whole story of everything that happened that night on Chappaquiddick to come out. And barring that any of the living, boiler room girls still might help the public understand what happened by coming forward. Barring any of that, we're probably not going to get a full accounting of what happened. He blazes through Boston Airport, the Logan Airport, and he gives the statement that he is satisfied that the court had acted judiciously, and he says so he wants to get this underway so I can get on with representing the people of Massachusetts. So that's where he says his focus is. And he now, though, is under authority. No court ruling could relieve Kennedy of the requirement to put the full story of what had happened before or after the accident on the record. He had now only bargained the circumstances under which he would answer questions, not whether questions had to be answered. But once the inquest was over, he said he intended to give a detailed public accounting of what he knew about the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. Of course, in hindsight, even when this book was written in 1988. So 19 years after the accident. And of course now, where we sit now, we are 55 years after the accident. So, of course, we know he did not ever give a public accounting of what he knew about the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. Boyle declined to set a date for the inquest until Judge Berminski ruled on the exhumation and autopsy. Gwen Chappaquiddick said she didn't care whether the inquest was closed or open. I just wish they would hurry up and get it over with. We were disappointed when it was postponed. We're totally opposed to an autopsy. The answers to the questions are in Massachusetts, not here. I just wish Mr. Denise would have his inquest and clear up the whole situation. Again, I find it fascinating how she talks out of both sides of her mouth. If you want all the information to come out, why not go on and say, you know what? For the sake of truth, for the sake of my daughter, I'm going to go ahead and deal with my own emotions and let the autopsy happen so that every fact of truth that can be discovered at this point can be. Maybe it's going to show nothing. That would be great. It's on the state's cost, it's on the state's effort, and I'm not going to be there watching while they do it, but I'm going to know that everything was done properly. So it's this emotion-driven decision on her part. It seems that she talks out of both sides of her mouth. She wants all the facts over here. She doesn't want anything done over here. On Tuesday, November 18th, 1969, at 11:04, Joseph P. Kennedy died in his sleep at the age of 81. A white mass was celebrated at St. Francis Xavier Church in Hyannis by Richard Cardinal Cushing. Senator Kennedy paid tribute to Anne Gargan's loyalty, devotion, and great love as a companion to his father, who had been invalided by a stroke in 1961. Now this, I want to point out, is Joey's sister. So Joey Gargan, who we've been talking about this whole time, that set up the house on Chappaquiddick, that has been a primary source for this book, who is a first cousin to Ted Kennedy, and was there for the whole weekend of Chappaquiddick, the one who dove in, all of it. His sister, Anne, is the one who had been caring for Ted's father, Joe, in the final 8 years of his life. So she dedicated 8 years to caring for old Joe, which is quite a service piece, I think, to have done. Well, 3 days later, a memorial mass at the church marked the 6th anniversary of John Kennedy's assassination. Interestingly, after this, it says that among friends, Kennedy was again able to laugh and enjoy himself. And those who knew Kennedy said he's snapping back. I mean, to me, it's interesting that Damore put that little comment in the same little section with Joe's death. We have heard that Joe was a very demanding father. We know that he was a very controlling man. And then, of course, for 8 years, he had been under the effects of a stroke. We don't know his communication level, although I think there are some records of that. I'm not personally sure of every level of communication. The movie for this book showed more communication by old Joe than I think was actually technically possible. But I do think it's interesting that this book makes it clear that Kennedy is suddenly able to laugh and enjoy himself again, which normally you would think with the death of your father, that would not be something that would bring about joy and humor in your life. So it's just interesting that he's deep in the sorrows of Chappaquiddick. They're a year and a half out from RFK's death. They are now 6 years past JFK's death, and something about his father passing perhaps was like a little key in his soul that brought about the capacity to relax again and snap back. The senator acknowledged he was feeling better. Not having to read about the case in the newspapers every day helped. He was now awaiting the inquest, eager to clear up all the remaining questions, he said. Well, Crimmins, remember the drunk chauffeur who gives it back to Ted at the party. He's back now chauffeuring Kennedy in Boston, and Gargan is once again advancing campaign stops. It says it was politics as usual, a public display of confidence. This is fascinating because my understanding was that Joey Gargan was held at a distance during this whole period, and that actually this incident separated the two, that Ted and Joey never again enjoyed a personal relationship. But what we've been told through Leo Damore's book is that, remember in August when the Senate was on break, that they went on a long camping trip with their sons. And then now we have that he's doing campaign work for him. So different than I thought. The senator had every reason to be optimistic. He had now altered a judicial procedure which had stood for 82 years, and his attorneys had won every legal round in the courts. Another victory was now on the heels of all of this. On Wednesday, December 1st, Judge Berminski barred the exhumation of Mary Jo Kopechne. There was, he ruled, no evidence to indicate anything other than drowning had caused the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, even if an autopsy revealed a broken neck, a fractured skull, or the rupture of internal organs. None of these would be incompatible with the manner in which this accident occurred. So, I think this is interesting, and I actually think this is a really fair ruling, even though as the parents, I would not have opposed. I think his judgment is fair, that whoever was in the car, we know would have potentially hit the windshield, hit the dash, been tumbled back over seats, and so there could have been internal injuries because of the force of the accident. I mean, what we're told is that there were no brakes applied. So then however fast the person was going, they went off the bridge and hit and potentially rolled and was underwater really fast. The force of the water in the pond was really big. We don't know for sure what injuries would have happened. So I think that's a fair ruling. I don't know. What do you think? I do think that Berminski had, people had worked their influence on him. I'll say it that way. But now Damore does point out to us to consider any other cause of death at this time, Berminski said, would give loose rein to speculation unsupported by any medical facts of record. But actually, Damore tells us the lack of an autopsy guaranteed that speculation and rumor would continue to flourish. Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, I don't think they would have been able to prove that there had been sexual interaction, but it would have been good to try. It would have been good to put to death every possible speculation that you could. Berminski had taken the opposition of the Kopechnes into account, he said. In view of the facts presented, their objections are well taken. This decision came as no surprise to Denise. Berminski had played politics every step of the way. He even waited until he won a new 10-year term on the bench before he made his ruling. That seems a little too obvious to me. That seems like, hey, if you guys help me get elected, I'll rule favorably. Who knows? We don't know. But it does seem suspicious that he had delayed, and then delayed till right past he's reelected before he's going to go ahead and give a ruling. To criminal attorney Melvin Belly, he says the irony is the public's impression that the JFK autopsy was unsatisfactory. And now Teddy Kennedy's female companion gets none. The Kennedy family is hiding the actions of those 2 days. They've gone around parading themselves as sponsors of the little people, and yet let that little person in the back seat of a car go unexamined to the grave. Fair enough, Mr. Belly. That is so true. Berminski's ruling, however, pleased Gwen Kopechne. I can't tell you how wonderful I feel, she said. Now I know my daughter will not be disturbed and will be at rest. Speculation of sexual misconduct was clearly on Mrs. Kopechne's mind, anxious as she was to preserve her daughter's reputation. There were increasing reports as the days multiplied, and one such report said that a party in Washington 1 month before Chappaquiddick that Mary Jo had been there and had been somewhat vocal and demonstrative, even sitting on the lap of a man who was someone else's date. She had a little too much to drink and was flirting and more girlish than usual. So stories are coming out that are not favorable to Mary Jo and that would lend themselves to this idea of, what in the world were a bunch of married men doing out there with single girls? That whole storyline and questioning. Mrs. Kopechne said, Mary Jo was a wonderful girl, so aware and full of life. Nobody had announced it. How could you? But there was an examination of my girl, and it showed she was a maiden lady. And she's saying there was an examination of her girl, and she was a maiden girl. And this is biblical language, actually, for a virgin. You know, there's a verse in the Bible that says, how then could you do this to a maiden? And it means to a virgin, the word. And so that was like a softer term for a virgin that I think she would have known and used. So she is giving, you know, this is a month prior to what has been ruled, but she is giving the impression, my daughter was checked out and she was for sure a virgin. So all of this speculation is really out of hand. So that's what she was focused on. Now the Kopechnes were waiting for the inquest. That Judge Boyle had refused to allow them or their attorneys to attend was upsetting. She says, we're the parents of this girl, and it's as if we don't exist. Joseph Chappaquiddick added, there's a lot of questions we want answered. You have to have a daughter to know how we feel. Senator Kennedy telephoned the Kopechnes. Once again, he's making the call when he has to express his pleasure at Brzezinski's ruling, because I realized how much it means to the Kopechne family. It increases their peace of mind, and I'm grateful for that. Judge Boyle scheduled the inquest for Monday, January 5th, 1970. So that gives them a little over a month at that point. Here are our Chapter 47 observations. First, the inquest will be private, so constitutional crisis has been avoided. Wall Street Journal and others accuse a curtain of secrecy. Ted is still promising to tell all afterward. Joe Kennedy dies 11/18/69, so November. Senator Ted, we're told, is now snapping back. He is cheery and laughing it up, and he's coming back. On the 1st of December, Judge Brzezinski rules there will be no exhumation or autopsy, and ironically, this cements the case into the realm of speculation. The Kopechnes are happy that there will be no autopsy. They are upset that they cannot attend the inquest. Chapter 48. Suddenly, we have a new eyewitness, y'all. This is crazy. On December 18th, private investigator J.E. Gautreaux filed a final confidential report to Edward Hannafy. Now, this is interesting because it's an evidence that's been uncovered by the defense for Ted Kennedy, so not by the investigation. His investigation had found nothing to compromise the witnesses, but he had uncovered one piece of information with disquieting implications for Ted Kennedy's defense. This was an eyewitness who could possibly corroborate Huck Look having seen the accident car hours after the senator said it had gone off Dyke Bridge. Remember, Ted said they left for the ferry at 11:15. Okay, went down, made a wrong turn, went off the bridge. We're talking 11:20 at best. But Huck Look said after 12:30, probably closer to 12:45, pushing toward 1, he sees a car parked in the cemetery road. It backs out. When he approaches it, it takes off in a blaze of smoke, and that's the last that he sees. So that would put the accident at right around 1 a.m. Nancy McDonald, employed as a waitress at the Harborside Hotel during the summer, she and the assistant manager had walked to Edgartown Lighthouse Beach around 12:30 on Saturday, July 19th. They were seated on the dock when their attention was drawn to an automobile traveling at a high rate of speed on the road leading to the ferry slip on Chappaquiddick, 350 yards across the harbor. So I'll put up a map. On the map, you can see that Edgartown, butts right up next to Chappaquiddick. And there's a 350-yard distance between the two. But at night, everything's quiet. If you remember, it was a quiet night. The ferry, the water on top seemed calm. Everything seemed steamy and hot that night. So they go down to the beach on this side at Edgartown, and they're there watching when they see an automobile traveling at a high rate of speed. A large American-style automobile. The car stopped at the landing and the headlights were turned off. To her and the companions, this seemed rather odd since the ferry had closed down for the night. So this is 12:30, remember. That account suggested that Senator Kennedy had been driving around the island after leaving the party and could have approached the landing before his confrontation with Huck Look. Okay, so that's the new witness that was found. Very interesting. Now, the state police investigation had not uncovered this. So this is really more the defense doing due diligence more than the state police. And they have found this witness it's like, heads up, this could corroborate Huck Look's account if anybody finds her. I mean, it's interesting. If you were a witness in that situation and you had been contacted by a PI and you realized that there might be some usefulness to your testimony, what would you do? Would you go to the police then with your observations? I feel like I would. Not even in the mode of a tattletale, but just like, hey, if this can be helpful to like corroborate what's happened, I just want to put this out there that this is what we saw. I don't know. I think I might not go up. I might not even know that what I saw had anything to do with it. But once a PI contacts you, I feel like you'd know a little bit more to like, well, maybe this would be helpful to the police. I'll go ahead and offer this. Bernie Flynn, the investigator that has given us multiple accounts of what he thinks happened, kind of predictions or his theories of what happened, he reports to Stephen Smith, that's Ted's brother-in-law, remember, in late December. He calls him to let him know we had nothing that's going to be embarrassing to Ted Kennedy at the inquest. They aren't going to ask him anything he doesn't know already. And Smith wanted to be sure there's nothing else you can tell us about the evidence that you're going to present at the inquest. Flynn said he did have negative information, which could be helpful. He proposes a meeting with Smith at Logan Airport in Boston. And so Flynn's waiting at the ramp when Smith appears. He was surprised that he was also accompanied by Washington lawyer Jack Miller. This is the first person, remember, that he had met up with in the airport down in Washington. Smith had not mentioned that he was bringing Miller, and Miller was carrying a briefcase. Smith suggests a drink in the airport's cocktail lounge, and Flynn feels concerned that someone might recognize him at that place. Miller was more at ease than he was in Washington. He put the briefcase on my left, almost in my lap. The first time in Washington, I didn't care. The second time around, I figured, why should I let him tape it again? Seated across the table from Flynn, Stephen Smith said, is there anything more you can tell us? So Flynn filled them in on what he had learned about what he thought would be covered by the inquest. He says, what I was trying to do was, if they had any fears at all about coming, I could allay those fears. It's a nice feeling to know that nothing's going to be thrown at you that's going to put you off your equilibrium. I'm thinking of Ted Kennedy going into the inquest frightened, not knowing what's going to be dropped on him. My whole thought was, I knew Ted had lied on TV. I didn't want him to go into the inquest and get caught in another lie. He could walk in knowing there wouldn't be any bombs. We don't have anything that could contradict Ted Kennedy except for Huck Look and the witnesses I had already discussed with Miller. I wanted them prepared for that. Flynn did most of the talking, and he says basically, this is what I call negative information. The fact that we have nothing new. Everything is what I already told you. Stephen Smith asks again, are you sure there's nothing else that we need to know? Nope, that's it. He says, I'm trying to show him this is worth your trip to Boston. This is information as important as if I did have something new. That Kennedy's license had expired wasn't going to be brought up, Flynn said. Telephone records had been subpoenaed. but they were not going to be used. Stephen Smith said again, "Are you sure there isn't anything else?" Flynn assured him again. And then Smith wanted to know, well, what do you want as far as payment then? And he says, "You tell Ted Kennedy that I'm frightened. If this ever gets out, I'm cooked." He knew he was liable to a possible charge of conspiracy if any of this got out. And so he feels the very least he could expect at that point would be a demotion and a punitive assignment. And he says, so if I'm ever transferred to the western part of the state, I want help from Ted to get back to Cape Cod where I belong. So that's the assurance that he receives. Flynn was satisfied that he would never need to be concerned again about losing his plum assignment. To have helped Ted Kennedy was the best kind of job insurance to have. In order to preserve his career as a police officer, Flynn had betrayed it. Damore hit that one out of the park. That is so accurate. Well, assured that no bombs were going to be dropped, Senator Kennedy is now expressing confidence that criminal charges were not likely to be developed against him at the inquest. He gave a little answer when he went on a skiing holiday in Vail with Joan. He said, "Do you think that if I knew there was anything else that could come out of this, I would not have given up my Senate seat? I know what happened there, and I'm the only one who knows. There's nothing else that can be said about it." So we're not only getting happy, laughy Ted after his father passes, but now that more and more legal battles have gone in his favor, now that there will be no exhumation and autopsy, and now that he's been assured via his lawyers that, hey, they're not going to have anything on you, everything's locked up, whatever. Even though he's out from the January inquest, he's already expressing confidence and he's good. Kennedy goes back to Washington on New Year's Day to meet with Jack Miller. He spent January 3rd and part of Sunday in Boston rehearsing his testimony. He was not looking forward to the inquest, an aide said. It's painful for him, painful for the family. He wants to clear it up once and for all. The most painful question that Senator Kennedy would be required to answer was why he had abandoned a helpless young woman in his car for 10 hours. His answer would have a lot to do with whether that action could be used to bring charges against him. Judge Boyle could contend his failure to alert authorities and rescue personnel had constituted criminal negligence and accused Ted Kennedy of willful, wanton, and reckless conduct by not reporting the accident. The Bridge at Chappaquiddick by Jack Olson was published on Friday, January 2nd. To ensure against leaks, access to a single copy of the manuscript was restricted to 3 employees of Little, Brown and Company of Boston. Despite precautions, a clandestine approach to a production supervisor at the printing plant was made by a Democratic political figure seeking a bootleg copy. A bribe offer was made, but Senator Kennedy had nothing to fear from the book. Produced under the pressure of a narrow deadline, Olson failed to resolve any of the mysteries attending the accident. He had had no luck with the senator or anyone close to the Kennedy family, of course. To fill in the gaps, Olson had expropriated Bernie Flynn's theory that Senator Kennedy had not driven the accident car off Dyke Bridge. This is how he describes it in his little tome. Aware of the political implications of being on a deserted road late at night with a young, unmarried woman, Kennedy had stopped the car, gotten out, told Mary Jo to circle back, to pick him up from fear a police officer would ask him questions. Seated behind the wheel of a strange and powerful car, she had had no time to adjust the seat in order to reach the gas and brake pedals comfortably. Barely able to see the road ahead, Mary Jo had driven in a straight line off Dyke Bridge. Kennedy had given a different version of the accident because he had a public image to consider. It would be simpler for Kennedy to fudge a few minutes off the time and claim that he and Mary Jo had been headed for the ferry and had simply taken a wrong turn. Olson couldn't explain why Senator Kennedy should flee a police officer if he wasn't doing anything wrong. Driving a car on Chappaquiddick with an unmarried woman at any hour was no offense warranting an interrogation, unless Kennedy was afraid of being arrested for drunk driving. This was a portion of Flynn's theory that Olson omitted from his book. A more serious defect in the theory was, why, knowing a police officer had seen the car, did Kennedy think he could fudge an hour and a half off of the time with a witness available to contradict him, as had proven to be the case with Huck Look? Olson said he had thought a lot about the differential in the time, and the obvious answer was that they were playing around in the weeds. This wasn't in the book. I didn't want to get sued for libel. It was enough to say that Ted Kennedy was at a party with 6 unmarried women and had left with Mary Jo Kopechne. She had had a few drinks. She's very giddy and excited. She's with Kennedy, a lifelong dream. He's probably been loving her up a little. Just to be in the car with him in the middle of the night on a deserted island, I couldn't say that in the book, but she must have been beside herself with excitement, this spinster girl. What was she, 28? Oh man, this was not a lifelong dream for anyone. Olson's book puzzled Arena. If Kennedy wasn't in the car, why throw yourself to the wolves and say you were driving? That Kennedy felt the other story was the thing he should stick with. Well, he's certainly stuck with it now, because if he changes his story, who's going to believe him? Every time Arena thought about the various theories proposed, he says, I say to myself, how come Kennedy knew enough to come to the station and tell me she went off the bridge if he wasn't in the car? On Sunday evening, January 4th, Arena held an informal press briefing. Security at the inquest would be strict. Witnesses would enter and leave through the front door between a double file of police. Reporters would be required to stand behind barricades. So he is giving information so that everyone can know what to expect from the inquest. Court clerk Tommy Teller was also observing the secrecy imposed by the proceedings of the Supreme Court. He was refusing to disclose the names of witnesses who would appear or had been subpoenaed to appear at the inquest. A cadre of Kennedy aides had now arrived in Edgartown before the weekend to prepare for the inquest. And Richard McCarran, remember that's the local lawyer who they retained because Edgartown has to have a local lawyer that would do the legal footwork there on the island. He hasn't done very much, but he did rent a house on School Street, which would serve as headquarters for Ed Hanafy and Robert Clark. And he also provided an apartment in the building that he owned where the Boiler Room girls would be served a daily luncheon. McCarran hired 2 local drivers for the young women, and they arrived by chartered plane. There is a picture of this, so I will put that up. They arrived by charter plane from Boston on Sunday afternoon, mini-skirted, more attractive, and younger looking than their press pictures had shown. They ignored shouted greetings from reporters and pleas from photographers to pose. They moved resolutely toward the rental automobiles that would take them. Now, I just have to say, I guess this is indicative of the age. It's 1969. We've gone through, the summer of love and all of that. But I just feel, why would you wear miniskirts? It's January. Why would you dress like that? You know what's being said about this young lady. You know what's been said about you. You've worked on the Hill. You know what professional garb is like. So why not just wear a pantsuit or a skirt suit or something a little more appropriate? But mini-skirted and attractive just sounds like they're almost playing it up. It's almost in your face. The girls arrived at the Edgartown courthouse the next morning for the start of the inquest, and police cleared the sidewalk. Once inside, the girls were served with subpoenas. The observations for Chapter 48 are these. There's a new witness that tells a PI for the defense that they saw a similar or even likely Kennedy vehicle speeding, then stopping at the ferry landing and turning their lights off. Unfortunately, this information was found by the defense, not by the police, so it didn't even come to light. Flynn reassures Smith that there's nothing new. You know everything. There will be no bombs at the trial. He does ask for future career help if he needs it. That would be his payment. Ted is rehearsing with Miller, who has been a part of all these investigative connections with Flynn, these little sneaky airport meetings. Miller is the guy who has gotten word directly from Flynn, so he knows precisely what case the police are going to bring. And so he's rehearsing with Ted. Jack Olson publishes his book, which essentially floats Flynn's theory about Ted, that Ted jumped out, and thus Mary Jo went off the bridge alone. The inquest, everyone's in town, and it's about to happen. That's what chapter 48 brought us. Chapter 49. I want to point out, this is nearly 6 months after the accident. Senator Kennedy stepped off a chartered plane at Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9:15 a.m. He was looking forward to responding to any and all of the questions, he told reporters. Kennedy was hopeful that the record would be completed, and I can get back to the business of devoting my energies to the Senate. Driven to the house on School Street, Kennedy conferred briefly inside, then stepped off for a 100-yard walk to the courthouse, accompanied by his wife and 4 state troopers. This is interesting. Arena had actually received word from Kennedy that they should back off from the police presence because Ted did not want photos taken that made him look like a criminal. So he did not want the cadre of police officers that he had to walk through, because that would be a jail-like image. That would be a humiliating image, like he's going in and they had to, make sure he arrived and all of that. So they pull back their police presence, which is interesting. They are definitely caring about appearances. Kennedy's solemn, and a reporter calls out, "Are you glad it's finally underway?" "Yes, I am," Kennedy said. He waited on the courthouse steps while his wife weaved through the throng of spectators. Ready to open the courthouse door was Bernie Flynn. This historic moment preserved in a photograph that he clipped from the New York Times. Though others didn't know it, Flynn was also opening the door for Ted Kennedy to play the inquest game with a stacked deck, he said later. When Joan Kennedy came out of the courthouse 10 minutes later, the press secretary for Ted drew the reporter's attention to the fact that Judge Boyle's rules said that no one could stay. And so she really wanted to accompany Ted to the courthouse, he said. Promptly at 9 a.m., clerk of the court, Tommy Teller, formally opened the inquest. R.E. Mary Jo Kopechne. The inquest was not a prosecution of anyone, Judge Boyle told all lawyers and witnesses. The courthouse did not provide facilities for the sequestering of witnesses. However, he made it clear witnesses after testimony are ordered not to discuss their testimony with anyone except his or her counsel. One difficulty with this that Boyle recognized is that Redmond and Daly represented a substantial number of witnesses. These are the lawyers that have been brought in and purchased by Ted Kennedy for the male participants in the party as well as the Boiler Room girls. Boyle said he was specifically ordering attorneys not to discuss the testimony of one client with another client. Hannafy made sure he understood those orders, and then Boyle excuses everyone from the courtroom except Denise and his legal staff. In keeping with the secrecy order imposed, State Police Trooper Robert Enos and George Killen were asked to leave. So Killen joins Bernie Flynn in the corridor outside the courtroom. They're there, ready to summon witnesses as they come. Before the inquest in September was postponed, Denise had proposed that Chief Arena and other Edgartown locals should testify first, followed by those who had attended the party at Chappaquiddick, with the exception of Paul Markham, Joey Gargan, and Senator Kennedy. Denise had wanted them questioned last and in that order. But Judge Boyle had a different arrangement in mind. He said he would not keep a U.S. Senator waiting. Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to discover evidence, then the right way to go about it would be to start with those early observations, right? Denise, Farrar, maybe the fisherman who discovered, whoever else needs to be to establish the facts of the case before you learn that there's a party, right? That would have been the proper order of things. In fact, that's the order that Damore takes in this book. But Judge Boyle did it his own way. Denise now proposed that Robert Malloy, a general accounting supervisor of the New England Telephone Company, would lead off the inquest. Boyle suggested that Malloy not be called until some foundation was made to indicate that his testimony was relevant. But this is interesting. So this is all in a footnote, but I want to share it with you because it is fascinating information. Malloy's attorney, Charles Parrott, came to the courtroom prepared to offer 4 lists of telephone calls that were charged to Kennedy's credit card accounts in Boston, Washington, and Virginia, none of which showed any calls made during the hours after the accident or before Kennedy called Helga Wagner after 8 a.m. at the Shiretown Inn. So that is interesting. That makes it to where no calls were made all night. He calls Helga Wagner at 8 a.m. Now, this is different than the picture that was presented in Ask Not, right there. She was like, 17 calls were made all night long. He was calling his overseas girlfriend. Not so. And actually, apparently, the reason that he called Helga Wagner was because she was in touch with Stephen Smith. And now that we're at this point in the story, we understand the kind of legal footsies and financial things that Stephen Smith is he's a fixer for Ted Kennedy. Now that we understand that, we understand why he called Helga, because she was about to leave to go on vacation with Stephen and Jean Smith, which Jean Smith is Ted's sister. So he called Helga to try to get information to get in touch with Stephen after 8 a.m., the morning after the accident, and that's the only call that he made. Interesting. In a 9-page memorandum for his own files, he wrote, "There was no discussion about records of calls by putting dimes and quarters in the box, or collect calls, or charging calls to your home number." But Parrott denied that any telephone company records had been withheld. So it's interesting. These are the calls that were made by Ted Kennedy's credit card only. So it's possible there were more calls. And I'll give her the benefit of the doubt a little bit that perhaps she has more information now than Damore had in 1988, although that seems unlikely given the extreme number of endnotes that we have in this book. Literally from right here all the way to the end is endnotes and appendices. I mean, this is a fantastically researched book. So I just found it interesting that there was not some slew of calls by the telephone company's records. Denise called Senator Edward Kennedy as the inquest's first witness. Kennedy entered the courtroom accompanied by Hanafy and Clark. He took the witness stand in a near-empty courtroom to put on the record what he had avoided direct questioning about for more than 5 months. There was nothing straightforward about what Kennedy put on the record. Instead, it was a lattice work of evasions and omission, of half-truths and obfuscation, patched together by a phalanx of lawyers and advisors. So now we get his story, and it's in paragraph form. There are some quotes, and I'll try to tell when they're important, but this is essentially his testimony. Arriving at Edgartown on Friday, July 18th, Kennedy was brought to Chappaquiddick and driven over Dyke Bridge as a passenger in a 4-door Oldsmobile 88, operated by Jack Crimmins. After a swim at East Beach, Kennedy was returned to Edgartown for the regatta race, then checked into the Shiretown Inn, visited with friends, and returned to Chappaquiddick to soak his back in a hot tub until the party guests arrived in a rented Valiant around 8:30 p.m. Kennedy had initially tended bar. Then, I think most of the individuals made their own drinks after that. He had engaged in conversations and recollections with guests, which were old friends of myself and our families. He left the party at approximately 11:15 p.m. He said, quote, "I was talking with Miss Kopechne, perhaps for some minutes before that period of time. I noticed the time, desired to leave, and returned to the Shiretown Inn, and indicated to her that I was leaving and returning to town. She indicated to me that she was desirous of leaving, if I would be kind enough to drop her back at her hotel. I said, well, I'm leaving immediately. Spoke to Mr. Crimmins, requested the keys for the car, and left at that time. Mr. Crimmins, as well as some of the other fellows attending the cookout, were concluding their meal, enjoying the fellowship, and it didn't appear to me necessary to require him to bring me back to Edgartown. Kennedy said. Here's how Damore wraps up that little piece of testimony. He says, drunk, truculent, and demanding that everyone leave, Crimmins could hardly be said to be enjoying the fellowship. That's a good point. Mr. Crimmins was a total jerk to all the party residents, was hoping they would all leave. He wanted them all gone by midnight. So he wasn't enjoying the fellowship. Concluding the meal and enjoying the fellowship. That's not an accurate representation. Although the question wasn't asked, Kennedy denied any personal relationship whatsoever with Mary Jo Kopechne. It says he left the party for the ferry landing, traveling down, I believe it is Main Street, and taken a right turn on Dyke Road. Kennedy disposed of Huck Look's anticipated testimony in short order. At no time had he driven into Cemetery Road, backed the car up, or seen anybody between the cottage and Dyke Road, he said. I did not stop the car at any time. I passed no other vehicle. I saw no other person. Kennedy was driving approximately 20 miles an hour, taking no particular notice that Dyke Road was unpaved, or that he was not heading for the ferry landing. He had applied brakes a fraction of a second before I was on the bridge and about to go off. The next thing I recall is the movement of Mary Jo next to me, the struggling, perhaps hitting or kicking me, and I, at this time, opened my eyes and realized I was upside down, that water was crashing in on me, that it was pitch black, and I was able to get a half a gulp, I would say, of air before I became completely immersed in the water. I realized that Mary Jo and I had to get out of that car. That is damning. I do want to point out that he is not putting himself hopping out a car or hopping out a window out of the bobbing vehicle. He is putting himself right inside of the upside down car with water crashing in on it. Kennedy tried to get the door open by reaching what I thought was down, which was really up, and feeling alongside the door panel to see if the window was open. Here is his testimony about that. And I can remember the last sensation of being completely out of air and inhaling what must have been a half a lungful of water and assuming that I was going to drown. And the next full realization was that no one was going to be looking for us until the morning, that I wasn't going to get out of that car alive. Then, somehow, coming up to the last energy of just pushing, pressing, and coming up to the surface, I have no idea in the world how I got out of that car. Judge Boyle asked Kennedy to describe what he had seen as he was driving from the point when you first saw the bridge. He estimates that it would be fractions of a second from the time I first saw the bridge and was on the bridge. Your attention was not diverted by anything else? Boyle asked. No, it wasn't, Kennedy said. I want to go to the question of alcoholic beverages, Boyle asked. Kennedy had had 2 rum and cokes at the party. He wanted to go back before that. I think you said you visited friends at Shiretown? Kennedy had had a third of a beer, he recollects, but Boyle hadn't gone back far enough. Kennedy doesn't mention the victory party at Ross Richards' boat, at which he had drank 3 rum and cokes. After Boyle was assured that Kennedy had been made aware of his constitutional rights with regard to self-incrimination, he said, "Were you at any time that evening under the influence of alcohol?" Absolutely not, Kennedy said. He had been absolutely sober when he drove over the side of Dyke Bridge, the scene of the accident Denise was anxious to resume his questions about. So that's interesting. I mean, he says 2 rum and cokes at the party and a third of a beer. You guys tell me in the comments if you think that's under the influence of alcohol. Perhaps there's a legal standard that he's referring to, but it's interesting. He says absolutely sober. I feel like that's a really loose standard here. Maybe absurd. You guys tell me in the comments what you think about that. After Kennedy escaped, he was swept away by the tide that was flowing at an extraordinary rate in Poocha Pond. I will say this is the same thing that Police Chief Arena experiences the next morning. So this seems entirely like it tracks with the truth. Wading up to his waist, he started back to the car, gasping and belching and coughing, to commence diving in an attempt to rescue Mary Jo Kopechne. Prevented from doing so by the fast current, he had returned again and again to try to gain entrance into the car, until at the very end, when I couldn't hold my breath any longer. You were fully aware of what was transpiring? Denise said, leading up to the question of shock. Kennedy knew what was coming, and he tried to slide under the question. Well, I was fully aware that I was doing everything that I possibly could to get the girl out of the car, and that my head was throbbing, and my neck was aching, and I was breathless, and at that time, hopelessly exhausted. But there was no confusion in your mind about the fact that there was a person in the car, Denise asks, which is a direct reference to Kennedy's speech on television. And I actually went back and looked up the exact words. Remember, he said, I had all kinds of scrambled thoughts. Whether the girl might still be alive somewhere out of that immediate area. So that's the question. There's no confusion that there's a person in the car. Kennedy ducks again. He says, I was doing the very best I could to get her out. On the last of 7 or 8 attempts to get into the car, he realized I just couldn't hold my breath any longer. I didn't have the strength to come down even close to the window or the door. I just knew that I could not get underwater anymore. He lost contact with the car and floated to shore, crawled up and staggered up someplace, and was very exhausted and spent on the grass. It says he rested on the banking for 15 to 20 minutes, regained his breath, and started going down that road, walking, trotting, jogging, stumbling as fast as I possibly could. It was extremely dark, and I could make out no forms or shapes or figures. The only way that I could see the path on the road was looking down the silhouettes of the trees on the 2 sides. To his knowledge, I never saw a cottage with a light on. He thinks that the walk back to the cottage had taken approximately 15 minutes. He says, as I came up to the back of the vehicle, I saw Ray LaRosa, and I said, Ray, get me Joe. Kennedy then climbed into the back seat of the car. Gargan came out, then Paul Markham. Kennedy said, there's been a terrible accident. Let's go, and returned to Dyke Bridge. I believe that I looked at the Valiant's clock and believed that it was 12:20, contriving to establish the time of the accident. When it was discovered by the Boston Globe in 1974 that the Valiant, rented for the regatta weekend, had no clock, Kennedy admitted, I made a mistake about the clock being in the Valiant that wasn't there. But he sought to correct this by saying, I am also aware that Paul Markham had a watch on and that I did determine the time. Kennedy had not participated in the rescue efforts undertaken by Gargan and Markham, he said, but I could see what was happening, and I made suggestions. You were fully aware of what was transpiring at the time? Denise reiterated. He keeps giving him a chance to either claim that he was shocked or discredit himself. And Kennedy wouldn't do it. He was fully aware that Gargan and Markham were trying to get in that car and rescue that girl. But Denise is now leading up to another inevitable question. Was there any effort made to call for assistance? There was no way around this question. It had to be answered. No, other than the assistance of Mr. Gargan and Mr. Markham. But they failed in their efforts to recover Miss Kopechne, Denise said. At this critical point in the examination, Judge Boyle interrupted the witness to ask Kennedy to leave the stand and the courtroom. Boyle told Denise that in his view, the purpose of this inquest was to determine whether criminal conduct had contributed to the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, not poor judgment or duplicity that followed. So, did criminal conduct lead to her actual death? Not, was there judgment afterwards? Now, that kind of does away with the question of, was she still alive in the car, right? It doesn't, because that would be contributing to her death, but he's not going there. Armand Fernandez recalled quite a tussle with Boyle about all the questions, stopping after the car hit the water and Mary Jo died. He wanted only testimony relating to whether the senator or anyone else had acted criminally in her death, not what anybody did afterwards. Vigorously protesting the limitations that Boyle was seeking to place on his examination of witnesses, Denise threatens to walk out of the inquest unless he's given more latitude to ask questions. Faced with the disruption of the inquest and the possible collapse of the entire thing, Boyle reluctantly accedes, but he would continue to cut Denise off in the middle of questions to admonish him. Boyle did not suggest how he would like it done, but he said, "I want to avoid as much as possible any trial techniques." So he's saying, I don't want you asking question that takes him somewhere. You're only establishing fact. But he didn't actually give him like, you can ask this many questions in a train of thought, or don't touch this subject, or it was just like, well, I'll give you a little more latitude. When Kennedy resumed the witness stand 20 minutes later, was there any particular reason why you did not call either the police or the fire department? Kennedy tries to duck the question. Well, I intended to call for assistance and report the accident to police within a few short moments after going back into the car. Did something transpire to prevent this? Denise asked. Now, at the most critical point in his testimony, Kennedy's answer on the record would be scrutinized, pondered, and tested for years to come. He said, "If the court would permit me, I would like to be able to relate to the court the immediate period following the time that Mr. Gargan, Markham, and I got back in the car." So here's how he relates it. "I believe it was about 45 minutes after Gargan and Markham dove, and they likewise became exhausted, and no further diving efforts appeared to be of any avail. So they came out of the water and came back into the car and said to me at different times as we drove down the road towards the ferry that it was necessary to report this accident. A lot of different thoughts came into my mind at that time about how I was going to be able to really call Mrs. Kopechne at some time in the middle of the night to tell her that her daughter was drowned, to be able to call my own mother and my own father, my wife. I mean, Ted never did call Joan. According to Maureen Callahan, she literally woke up the next day with his people milling around in her house, and she still didn't know what was going on and had received no call, even though Helga Wagner had when he was calling Stephen Smith. So this whole idea of calling my wife, that's courtroom antics. That's not truth. Even though I knew that Mary Jo Kopechne was dead and believed firmly that she was in the back of that car, I willed that she remained alive." He's going to get into this idea of willing her alive a lot. So I want to hear in the comments what you make of it. I think it's a bunch of baloney. "I was almost looking out the windows trying to see her walking down that road. Gargan and Markham understood the feeling, but said it was necessary all the same to report the accident. And about this time we came to the ferry crossing, and I got out of the car, and we talked there just a few minutes. I just wondered how all of this could have possibly happened. I also had sort of a thought, and the wish, and desire, and the hope that suddenly this whole accident would disappear. I related this to Gargan and Markham, and they reiterated that this had to be reported, and I understood at the time that it had to be reported, and I had full intention of reporting it. And I mentioned to Gargan and Markham something like, 'You take care of the girls, I will take care of the accident.' This is what I said, and I dove into the water." The only thing I'll say is that this is exactly what Gargan's account was. Whether or not he's colluding after the fact when he participates with the telling of this book, I don't know. But that is exactly what Gargan described. Kennedy had been prompted to give instructions not to alarm Mary Jo's friends that night and conceal the accident from the others at the party, because I felt that if these girls were notified that an accident had taken place and Mary Jo had in fact drowned, it would be only a matter of seconds before all of those girls who were long and dear friends of Mary Jo's would go to the scene of the accident and enter the water with, I felt, a good chance that some serious mishap might have occurred to any one of them. With that admonition, Kennedy dove into the channel. As he started to swim into the tide, I felt an extraordinary shove, the water almost pulling me down, and I realized suddenly I was in a weakened condition. Although I had looked over the distance between the ferry slip and the other side, it seemed to me an inconsequential swim, but the water got colder, and the tide began to draw me out. I remember being swept down toward the direction of the Edgartown light and well out into the darkness, and I tried to swim slower, at a slower pace, to be able to regain whatever kind of strength that was left in me. And sometime after that, I think it was about the middle of the channel, the tide was much calmer, gentler. Reaching the other shore, he pulled himself onto a beach. And all the nightmares and all the tragedy and all the loss of Mary Jo's death was right before me again. Now, this is interesting because it kind of fits with the account of the witnesses who did not see him swim or come up on the ferry slip or anything like that. It says that he was swept down toward the direction of the Edgartown light. So he was swept away from that Ferrytown slip. And it says he pulled himself up onto a beach. He found his way to a parking lot adjacent to the Shiretown Inn, leaning against a tree for a length of time, trying to really gather some kind of idea as to what had happened. He went to his room, took off his clothes, and collapsed on the bed. He was conscious of a throbbing headache, pains in his neck, and back strain. But what I was even more conscious of was the tragedy and the loss of a very devoted friend, he said. He put on dry clothes and opened the door to his room when he heard noises. I saw what I believed to be a tourist or someone standing under the light of the balcony, and I asked what time it was. He mentioned to me it was, I think, 2:30, and I went back into the room. Now, I just want to point out a few inconsistencies. Leo Damore points out one. He says, in his television speech, Kennedy had specifically identified a room clerk. So that week, he had already come to the conclusion that it was a room clerk. Now, he's either editing at the time, or maybe he's giving us an insight into this is who I thought it was at first. Later, I realized it had been a room clerk. He's saying, I thought it was a tourist. The other thing is that the room clerk described a clear-eyed, awake man who looked well-dressed, not somebody who's stumbling around, throbbing headache, pains, struggling, collapsing, barely finding his way, slipping on some clothes, doesn't know who he's talking to. That's not who's being described by the room clerk. The room clerk thought a well-dressed man, and he actually thought it was Joey Gargan. You remember, he thought it was the voice of Joey Gargan until he later realized, well, maybe it had been Ted because of the television speech. Damore points out that in this lawyer reworked version of his story, it was more prudent not to be so exact about what he had observed, and this also would reduce the likelihood for somebody to think that he had been attempting to establish his presence in a different location rather than on Chappaquiddick at the island, which is, it seems obvious what was being done when he asks someone for the time at 2:30. Denise did not ask why Kennedy had not availed himself of this opportunity to report the accident. I never really went to bed that night, Kennedy continued. Even as that night went on, I almost tossed and turned and walked around the room. I had not given up hope all night long that by some miracle Mary Jo would have escaped from the car. Kennedy had spoken to the desk clerk the next morning. Remember, that's when he gets the dime from her. Then to Ross Richards and Stan Moore. He had been able to conduct these conversations without betraying any sign of distress, he explained to the Boston Globe. Because I was still in the frame of mind of false hope. This is 5 years after the accident. This is his explanation. He says, I was still in the frame of mind of false hope, that perhaps with the dawning of a new day, all the nightmare events of the evening before would have been washed away. But all hope absolutely disappeared when Gargan and Markham arrived at the Shiretown Inn. From just the look on their faces, I could tell that as hard as I had prayed for her survival, Mary Jo was dead. Up to that time, I really had tried to will her existence and life. This willing that he's talking about is like nonsense. It sounds like witchcraft to me. Like, what is he talking about? Is it just, I deeply desired it, and I've always gotten everything I ever wanted handed to me on a silver platter, so therefore I just thought the universe was going to deliver this great wish to me? What is he saying? I mean, I will say, it's kind of interesting that even as a public figure, he's putting himself in this absurd position of talking about willing someone to life when you know they're dead. It's a different era, I guess, but to me this sounds really small and non-logical, non-respectable for a man to admit to be doing this. They asked, had I reported the accident and why I hadn't reported the accident. I told them about my own thoughts and feelings as I swam across the channel, that somehow when they arrived in the morning they were going to say that Mary Jo was still alive. I told them how I somehow believed that when the sun came up and it was a new morning, that what had happened the night before would not have happened and did not happen, and how I just couldn't gain the strength within me, the moral strength, to call Mrs. Kopechne at 2 o'clock in the morning and tell her that her daughter was dead. He's such a weak, weaselly man. But Kennedy conceded he did make a private phone call to one of the dearest and oldest friends that I have, Burke Marshall. Kennedy did not volunteer that he had called Helga Wagner. He had returned to Chappaquiddick and called Burke Marshall, he said, because it was my thought that once I went to the police station, I'd be involved in a myriad of details, and I wanted to talk to this friend before I undertook that responsibility. But you didn't go directly from your hotel room to the police. Denise began to challenge the logic of the testimony, but Boyle interrupts again. He says, "Excuse me, Mr. Denise, we are now at 1 o'clock. I think we'll take a lunch recess." It was the second time during Kennedy's testimony that Boyle had rescued him from dangerous questions. It seems like right about the time that Denise gets some gumption to ask some hard questions, Ted gets rescued by Judge Boyle. The assistant DA observed, Kennedy did not seem confident of what he was saying on the witness stand. In his experience as a trial lawyer, he said, you can pick out those witnesses that are positive and assured. And Senator Kennedy impressed me that he was not. The senator returned to the house on School Street for a salad and sandwich lunch with his lawyers, and then he reviewed the situation thus far. The subject of alcoholic beverages had been introduced, but not aggressively pursued. And from his examination, Denise appeared to be verifying Flynn's intelligence that no bombs were going to be dropped at this inquest. Still, Kennedy had some rough moments left when he resumed the witness stand at 2 o'clock. Denise quoted from Kennedy's accident report. When I fully realized what had happened this morning, I immediately contacted the police. Denise asked, now is that in fact what you did? Once again, Boyle moved to the rescue. Mr. Kennedy already said this was a copy of the statement he made. Now won't you let the record stand for itself? Faced with repeated sabotage of his examination, Denise finally exploded. Well, I don't think it's possible, Your Honor, at this late date in my life to begin to change whatever style I have and the method of cross-examination. There is no cross-examination at this inquest, Boyle pounced. Clearly, Denise was not going to be allowed to pursue the inconsistencies between the police report and Kennedy's television speech. Frustrated, Denise said, no further questions. Neither did Boyle. He did want to know if Kennedy would be available in the event we needed you back for anything, and Kennedy said he would make himself available. But he did say, I would hope to be able to return to Washington sometime this week. Before he was released, Kennedy asked to consult his attorneys on one point that I might like to address the bench on. Whether Boyle wanted this repetition or not, he was going to get it. Kennedy wanted another run at the key question of the inquest. Why did you not seek further assistance after Mr. Markham and Mr. Gargan had exhausted their efforts in attempting to reach Mary Jo? Kennedy said, it is because I was completely convinced at that time that no further help and assistance would do Mary Jo any more good. I realized that she must be drowned and still in the car. And it appeared to me, the question in my mind was what should be done about the accident. Since the alcohol intake is relevant, Kennedy wanted to clarify the other element of manslaughter to which he was the most vulnerable. Although I haven't been asked for it, I feel in all frankness and fairness, and for a complete record, that it should be included as part of the proceedings. During the course of the regatta race, he said he had shared 2 beers with members of his crew. One other occasion in which there was some modest intake of alcohol would be after the race at the slip, in which Mr. Ross Richards' boat was moored. I shared a beer with Mr. John Driscoll. The sum and substance of that beer would be, I think, less than 1/4 of one. That gratuitous falsehood could be dropped into the record thanks to Bernie Flynn's assurance that neither Richards nor Stanmore were prepared to testify to the 3 rum and cokes Kennedy had imbibed at that party. Anything more? Boyle asked. Kennedy couldn't think of anything else to say. He came out of the courthouse looking immensely relieved, and for the first time since the accident, he again was the breezy and smiling, supremely self-confident Ted Kennedy. His 3 hours of testimony had generally paralleled his 2 previous statements about the accident, Kennedy told reporters, shivering in the 26 degrees cold outside. I'm satisfied I responded in the most complete way possible to all the questions put to me by the judge and the DA. He wanted his testimony released as soon as possible, he said, perhaps within days of the conclusion of the inquest. I expect to be vindicated and vindicated fully when the transcript is made public, and I am then allowed to answer questions. So, Chapter 49 observations are: Ted testifies nearly 6 months after the accident. Of note in his testimony is that everyone except Ted and Denise's legal team are excused from the courtroom. Ted is the first witness. He restates 11:15 is when they left. He denies any personal goings-on with Mary Jo Kopechne. He describes himself right in the drowning car. And I want to note, it sounds plausible to me. Judge Boyle interrupts and rescues Ted multiple times. Ted repeats this idea of wishing and willing Mary Jo Kopechne to live. He fumbles through and doesn't accurately relate the interactions with the desk clerk. And Denise tries a few repeated restated questions, but is shut down. Ted desires to make 2 additional points. Number 1, I thought she may have already been dead, meaning therefore he had no urgency. He was just thinking about the accident, but not her, because he assumed she was dead and felt that he knew she was dead. Number 2, he admits to 1/4 of a beer and then leaves the courtroom relieved. Well, that is the end of our reading today. So we got through so many things. I really was fascinated by the fact that there was this new witness that we hadn't even heard about, the book that was published, and the way that they floated Bernie Flynn's theory publicly right before the inquest. That's interesting to me, but I'm not sure how wide of circulation that book would have had. It's still interesting that it came up. The third thing is all of Ted's testimony. We finally hear in his own words, and I just want to say that as we get to this point in the book, his description sounds plausible to me, y'all. What about you? I think up until now, I've really thought, Bernie Flynn's theory that he wasn't in the car sounds the most right. But I do wonder, some people have mentioned that with alcohol sometimes comes greater flexibility with your body. And so maybe it is possible that he went through this great injury, but the alcohol just kept him loosey-goosey, and he was able to kind of slip out even though he had the back brace on. I mean, it seems unlikely, but I will say that his description of the stress and the propulsion that happened in Poocha Pond fits, all of that fits with the evidence of what Gargan testified to previously in his telling. We haven't gotten to his inquest testimony yet, but the things that he's told in his telling to Leo Damore, what Ted just said in the inquest actually fits with that. And then also Chief Arena not being able to get down because the current was so hard. He struggled to even get down to where he could hang on to the car. He never was able to get in. He didn't even realize that the windows were open. So just interesting things, I think. I would love to hear your thoughts. I'd really love for those of you who have hung in there with me through this story, tell me where you're at with all of this. Are you starting to believe what Ted said, and is the accident kind of coming together for you? I believe we have 2 more episodes left. I think we're going to do one where we get through a number of the Boiler Room Girl testimonies. And then I think after that, we will have one final episode where we hear the wrap up of everything that happened and try to get through any end material and any end thoughts. So we are down to the almost end of the wire. I hope you've been enjoying the book. And like I said, I really hope you'll join me for this book. This has been fascinating, and even if you are not particularly into royal topics, one thing that I'm finding is that it is pulling together some historic things for me and giving me context about what was happening inside the royal family during those years that's just broadening my understanding of the world, frankly. So I would love for you to join me for that, but be sure to come back for the final 2 episodes of this. I'm so thankful we're nearing the end, and I hope you enjoyed it today. Let me know what you enjoyed most, and we will see you next time. Bye, y'all.